Modeling is a vast skill set that you could always improve upon, but we're going to go through some of the basics in this video lesson so that you can get started with modeling and some of the most commonly used functions. Okay, so if you're struggling to follow along in the series at all, I'm actually saving these project files as I go along. So you can open my project files at any time and see where I'm at and follow along with me that way as well if you're struggling to keep up. So here we are in object mode, and I showed you how to move your object around, but we haven't discussed exactly how to edit our object. So what we're going to do is, if you switch to preferences like me, you will hold tab and switch to edit mode. Now, by default, it should be on vertex mode. So if you see these vertices that we have all around this cube, we can grab one vertex and we can grab that and we can move that around. And that is one way that we can edit our model. You can see what mode you're in up here, where you have vertex, faces, and edges. This is edges and this is faces. If you press 1, 2, and 3, it'll switch between them. So if I press 2, I can go in edge mode. An edge is a line drawn from vertex to vertex. I can grab that and move that around. A face is whenever all these edges come together to form one shape with a closed loop, and then we can grab that face and we can move that face around. Now, selection modes, we can use the box select and we can select everything there. We can press A to unselect, we can press A to select everything. We can come over here and we can press C, and let's actually switch to vertex mode, press C, and you can see that we can draw over these and just select those, and now we have a face selected. We can middle click and unselect those. So that works the same way in object mode. Over here, we have all of our different tools. These are your basic movement tools, so if you wanted to grab this, you could have your gizmos in here if you like working that way. That's a lot easier for most beginners. And we have our annotate. This is where we can take notes on the screen. Measure. This is where we can measure out real world coordinates if we're trying to create something physically accurate. And then right here is the bulk of the tools we're going to be using. There's some more tools down here. A lot of these tend to be more advanced tools or tools that you don't use as options. So we're going to focus on this little section right here. We have extrude region, inset faces, bevel, loop cut, and knife. Now these are the tools that you're going to use on most of your modeling most frequently. So let's actually switch to face mode, grab a face, let's hit extrude region, and we can grab this little tool and we can move that up or down and extrude there, and we can scale that in and out depending on how we want our model to look. So let's go ahead and undo that. There's other options in here that are more advanced options, but we'll discuss some of those later. So here we have our inset faces. If we click inset face and we just click on that and drag, you can see that it's actually going to inset that face inside of itself. Now, unlike the extrude, you could get a similar effect by extruding and scaling, but unlike the extrude, this won't add up or down. But then what we can do is we can go ahead and take our extrude and bring that in there. Now here we have our bevel modifier. So if we actually come into edge selection mode, let's select these 4 edges here, select these 4 edges here, and select these 4 edges here. We can actually go ahead, grab the bevel tool and click on that face there. We can actually drag and it will add a bevel. Now, any of these tools, when you're done, it will give you options here. So you can unclick that and see all the options. Now, this can be kind of intimidating with a bevel, but the big thing you're going to look at when you're using a bevel is how many segments you want to use. So right here, it's added this one face. So if we hit 2, you can see that it's going to add more faces there. And if we hit 3, see we're going to add more faces there. So for there, let's just add 3. Let's just click out of there. And now we've kind of inset our face, extruded it inwards, and then we've beveled the edges. So let's look at what a loop cut does. So a loop cut will actually loop around whatever part of the object it can and create what is called an edge loop. So if you just sit there and click, it will add one edge loop, or if you click and move, you can adjust where that edge loop is. But by default, it's going to go to the center. So let's actually go ahead and undo those. And here we have the knife cut. Now the knife cut, you can just drag on, and wherever it's red, it's creating a vertex, and we can just kind of snap there, hit enter, and you can see that just kind of cuts geometry wherever we put it. So let's undo that. Now, it's a much faster to use the shortcuts if you can remember those. So let's go ahead, tap 3. Let's go back to our selection mode up here. Let's click this face here. If you want to extrude, you hit E, and by default, it's going to go up and down on the Z axis. So let's undo that by right clicking and hitting Control Z. If we hit I, we can inset our faces. Undo that. Now this one doesn't make as much sense. E makes sense for extrude, I makes sense for inset, but knife or loop cut is actually Control R. And when we click here, it will let us drag, and then we can click again to set it. And again, we have our options there. Now K is for knife, and some of these tools you can see have all these extra options down here. So for knife, we can see that, for example, if we want to constrain it to an angle, we hit C. We'll see that now changes to on, and then when we begin to draw, it will constrain it to whatever angle we began drawing on. And if we hit enter, it will add that. So let's undo that. So those are the basics of the modeling tools that we will be using. So we talked about using box modeling as a basic form of modeling. So let's go ahead, let's add a cube here. Let's move this over on the y-axis. So now when you use box modeling, you're going to use a subdivision modifier on top of that box more often. So what a subdivision does is it's going to add extra geometry and attempt to smooth out between that geometry. So you can see here that if we turn that there, and we can adjust how many subdivisions it does. So to give you a visual illustration of what a subdivision looks like, if we come in here and we select everything and right click, we have the subdivide option. We can add these cuts, and you can see how it's kind of subdividing all these faces and adding extra geometry there. So let's undo that because that's a bit denser geometry than we want. Let's come over here. The advantage of using this modifier is that you can turn it on and off or get rid of it if you want, and you can adjust it real time, whereas subdividing, like I just did, is actually baked into the mesh at that point. So here we go. We can actually turn this viewport up so that we see more subdivisions. You have render and viewport. You can turn the viewport down if your viewport's lagging, and then it won't do all those extra subdivisions until it gets to the render. Whenever you add a modifier from this list, you can move it up and down in the stack, or you can press X to get rid of it. You can turn it off in the viewport, or if you want, you can turn it off in edit mode, but leave it on in the viewport, so when you go back out, it's there. So those are kind of the basic options you have. So let's look at how subdivision is affecting this model, because it can be kind of difficult to understand at first. So what it's doing is it is subdividing from edge to edge and then trying to create a smooth subdivision from there. So we've told it that we want it to subdivide to the power of 2, and that is going to divide this twice, giving us these 12 faces on top, and then it is trying to blend from edge to edge. Now let's see, we end up with like kind of a sphere looking shape. Now let's add a subdivision to this cube, and you can see that it's kind of rounded out, but it's much less round, and that's because we have all this extra geometry in there. So rather than just one edge to one edge, it has all this other geometry to calculate in between and kind of help keep structure more. So for example, let's say that we wanted this to be more of kind of like a trash can base. So let's hit Control R, add a loop cut here, and drag this down. So now when it subdivides, it only has to subdivide from this edge to this edge, giving us a sharper angle. If we wanted to do that even more, we could select this bottom face, inset that in, and you can see that now we have a sharper angle down there. Likewise, up here, if we wanted to sharpen maybe this inset in here, we could grab the face in there, and this is when it can be helpful to turn off in edit mode so you can see what you're doing more, and we can inset that in. But because we already have all these bevels, we have all these extra edge loops in here, you can see that for the most part it's kind of keeping its shape around there. So now let's actually tab out here, and you can see here that we actually have, let's turn our viewport up to 2. You can see that we actually have all these kind of sharp lines. So if this was a trash can, we'd want it to look smooth. Well, we have this object selected, and we can see that with this object selected that we have 1,000 faces in our scene already there. Now, the more faces you add in the scene, the more dense it's going to get, and the slower your computer is going to run. So you can imagine that if we had tens of thousands of faces to get this to look smooth, you know, how slow your computer would run. So for now, let's go ahead and delete this one. Let's click this. So to trick the computer into rendering from here to here smooth, we can right click it and hit shade smooth. And you can see there that that's kind of helped us out. Now, if we wanted, we could go ahead and add more geometry and get an even smoother circle there, and we could keep adding geometry until it's smooth. Now, these are the basics of box editing. You're going to be inside, you're going to be using those tools I mentioned and a subdivision modifier on top, and with these techniques, we will actually be able to create our character that we sketched in the last scene. So let's get started on our character.